Hi, everybody. It's Mr. Bob again. Time for our next book, Street Shadows, and Chapter 3 called Standoff. Up to now, we've started the chapters with Pika. Today, we start the chapter with Scruff's viewpoint. And again, I want you to see the compare and contrast between the two coyotes and their lifestyles, their parents, everything that they have known up to this point. I think it's an interesting thing. It's not unlike some of the things if you're reading with us in Peak. Peak is living in New York City. He has a father that's living in Thailand who's a world famous um, mountaineer, rock climber. Very successful mom and stepfather. Goes to a very exclusive school in downtown New York City and doesn't really take any of it, really. Um, Very few of us have those kind of experiences or have that kind of a background. And we don't really understand how other people see the world because we can only understand how we see it ourselves. And that's one of the reasons why books are important. It helps to give us a viewpoint of someone else's experiences. Oftentimes we dismiss other people and their experiences because they're not our own. But sometimes these kind of books, and even in the form of coyotes, we can kind of learn to appreciate and have some empathy for other people. Well, this is chapter 3 of the book Street Shadows by Claire Gilchrist, called Standoff. Scruff crouched, frozen, in the long grass. His front paw was raised and he listened intently, ears pointed at a spot a few steps in front of him. Above the soft breeze and bird calls he heard a faint scratching noise, and the sound of little feet crumpling the soft grass. He placed his paw carefully on the ground in front of him, barely breathing, and he took another step forward. Curling his claws into the soft, loamy earth, he inhaled the faint smell of a rodent. He heard a small rustle behind him and smelled Jagger. Aware of being observed, he felt an urgent need to prove himself. Inhaling and exhaling slowly and deliberately, he pushed all the other sensory information into his periphery. He needed there to be nothing in his mind except him and the mouths. And using each nostril independently, he homed in on the position of the rodent. He heard a small squeak, which further gave away the mouse's location. Then, with a sudden tensing and releasing of his hind leg muscles, he sprung high into the air. His front legs were fully extended and his claws were splayed wide. He landed with both paws firmly on the mouse. Dropping his head, he grabbed it in his mouth and killed it triumphantly with a quick shake of his head. He heard Jagger's gruff voice behind him. Not bad. Killing rodents at 3 months is better than most pups. Scruff turned, swelling with pride as he began to eat the mouse. He was glad that Jagger had been there to witness his successful hunt. Ever since he had been rescued from the crows, Jagger had taken care of him, supplying almost all his food and protection. After carrying him off into the forest, he deposited the weak little pup in a safe spot underneath a bush and found food for him. He delicately chewed the food up and regurgitated it so the pup would be able to eat it. He watched over him for the first few days with great concern, and it wasn't until 2 weeks later that he began to be sure that the pup would survive. Scruff didn't remember much of this time. It was all a blur of pain and hunger. That experience had deeply bonded him to the larger coyote, though, and he could not forget that he had a debt to repay. He still wasn't sure why Jagger had taken him in. He had been completely useless so far, but he meant to show him as soon as possible that he was able to contribute. Hopefully one day he could pay back the debt for his life. Finishing his mouse, Scruff noticed with disappointment that Jagger had moved on. He moved around restlessly, feeling the return of a familiar sense of loneliness. He lived with a feeling of emptiness inside of him most of the time, missing the family that he couldn't even remember that well. Jagger was reliable, but he was a solitary male and didn't like hanging around and talking much. Looking for something to do, Scruff sat along the edge of their forest territory, following a narrow, overgrown path that ran between the forest and the hillside up to a large housing subdivision. There was too much daylight to forage for food near the houses, so Scruff slid behind a bush at the top of the hill and peeked out the other side, looking for the hillside pack. Dane and Kai were far below, roughhousing in the shade of the hot sun. Pika was pouncing on insects, and he smiled at her intense concentration. Sage and the adult coyotes must be asleep under some bushes, he thought, because he couldn't see them. He was beginning to know this family well now. It had been 2 months since he had first met Pika, and he watched them often. A few times Pika had snuck away to play with him at the top of the hill, careful to return before her parents woke up. Once she had brought her brother Dane along, and they had all played together. These were the only times that Scruff got to laugh and play, and he wanted more. He had started to wonder if maybe the hillside adults were relenting about his presence on their territory. Even though his scent must still drift down from time to time, they hadn't issued any more alarm calls. He closed his eyes, fantasizing that he would one day be allowed to hang out with the whole family, hunting and playing with them. His stomach growled. He was still hungry. He smelled a vole in the meadow not far in front of him. His ears perked up and his mouth began to water. Voles were stockier than mice, and their flesh was sweeter. He had only caught one once because there weren't many in his forest territory. He felt his body become more alert, and his muscles twitched with excitement. He looked down the hillside again. Still no sign of the adults. The others were all absorbed in their activities. Surely they wouldn't notice if he crossed deeper into their territory to quickly catch a vole. He would retreat with it as soon as he had caught it. Slowly his body rose, and he began to stalk the rodent. He breathed in the warm air, happy to be doing something. He took a few tentative steps into the meadow and paused, waiting for the next clue. He picked up the sound of the vole again and continued it gently. The other sounds and smells of the hillside dropped away, and his world narrowed. All of his senses trained on the animal. For minutes, nothing happened. He took a few steps closer, then he heard a warning squeak, and the vole took off down a hole. Scruff bounded over to the hole, snuck his snout in, and inhaling the musky rodent smell, he sighed. Voles were excellent diggers, and once they went back into the hole, it was virtually impossible to catch them. Suddenly, he halted. Something was wrong. He looked up and stared straight into the eyes of the adult male from the hillside pack. Lamar was his name, he remembered from Pika's stories. The tall and imposing male was standing a short distance away, holding an aggressive, dominant stance, with his tail and hackles up. Looking down at the young pup, Lamar said sternly, "You trespass. You are not allowed on our hillside." Scruff took a few steps backwards, tail down, ready to run, and then froze. As the coyote's scent hit him, something jogged his memory. Darkness, the sounds of growls outside of his den, his mother growling, and then this growl. His head tilted to the side, confused. But before he had time to think about it, Lamar took 2 steps toward him. "This is not the first time that I have warned you to stay away. It's time." His voice was abruptly cut off by the thunderous growl from behind Scruff. Jagger stood at the edge of the hillside, his hackles high and his eyes glaring. "Lamar," he snarled, "are you threatening my packmate? Don't you have anything better to do than to terrorize a 10-pound runt?" "Jagger." Lamar's growl was equally threatening. "You know that this is my territory, and I'm prepared to defend it." There was a tense pause. No one moved. Scruff felt his chest constrict, and he couldn't breathe. Jagger glanced at Scruff. "Leave. Now. I'll find you later." His voice was a command. Scruff glanced at him and saw the serious look in his eyes. He glanced between the 2 coyotes for a few more seconds and then turned and ran back down the hill along the path, relieved to be returning to the forest. As he left, his ears turned backwards, straining to hear, wanting to know what was happening. But all he heard were low growls, and it was impossible to make out what they were saying. He felt guilty for having started the confrontation. What if something happened to Jagger, when he was only trying to keep him safe? He arrived at the spot in the forest where Jagger usually slept and lay down in the shade, breathing hard. Only a few minutes later, before Jagger passed before Jagger returned, limping slightly. Scruff yelped and jumped up and touched noses with him, sniffing over the rest of his body to make sure he was otherwise unhurt. "What happened? Are you okay? What did he say?" Jagger gave a long sigh. lowering himself gingerly beside Scruff. He tried to jump me in the end, but I dodged him and ran away. I put my paw in a bit of a hole, but I think it will be fine. He paused and added bitterly, I don't understand why he's so concerned about you. You are clearly not a threat to his precious family. He took a few long breaths, then looked down at Scruff with concern. Scruff, you shouldn't have been there today. I haven't prepared you as I should have. You need to know the hillside pack could be dangerous to you, to us. You need to stay on our side of the line. Scruff dropped his head. I'm sorry. I like watching them play. It's okay. He was overreacting anyway. He hesitated, then continued, You know, there's something that you should know about him, about them. What? Well, it has to do with your parents. Scruff felt his whole body constricted. Something squeezed his heart hard. He waited, unable to tear his eyes away from the older coyote. Suddenly, he realized that he knew what Jagger was going to say. The smell, the growl. He waited for confirmation. I probably should have told you earlier. I just wasn't sure how or when. Jagger paused, sighed, and then continued. You've always been curious about what happened to your family, and I told you that they all died of illness. Well, with your father, that was true. He got an infection all over his body, and it eventually killed him. After that, your mother was on her own. She was already weak from giving birth. I'm sorry to have to tell you this, but Lamar and Gree, that's his mate, they took the opportunity and killed her. Scruff sat still for a moment, stunned. I don't understand. Why? His voice was barely a squeak. Territory. The golf course and hillside aren't big enough for a pack of 7. They needed and wanted more space. Scruff looked at him, still confused. How do you know all this? Were you there? No, I wasn't. Before I didn't have my own home territory. But this was part of my hunting range. I knew your family pretty well, and I could see how sick your father was getting. Then I didn't see him anymore. A few more days later, and I came across your mother. She was dead. Lamar's smell was all around. It was pretty clear what had happened. Scruff was having trouble speaking. His voice came out scratchy, and he felt like he didn't have enough air. All this time, I didn't know, and he couldn't think of anything else to say. It hurt because it all made sense. He had smelled Lamar there, outside the den, when his mother was still alive. She must have been defending them, telling them to go away. He must have waited for the right opportunity, and then he couldn't continue the thought. Scruff jumped and paced away from Jagger. He felt suddenly furious. Whirling back at him, he glared at him. Why are you telling me this now? Why didn't you tell me before? He thought back to the number of hours he had watched over the hillside pack, wishing he was part of their close-knit family. The whole time he had been ignorant that they were responsible for the death of his own family. Jagger looked at him gently. Scruff, I'm sorry. You're so little. I didn't want you to be so upset and angry. I didn't want you to do something dumb like try to get revenge on them before you were ready. You've always been quite stubborn, and I wanted to make sure you were old enough when you learned the truth. I'll kill him. I knew you'd want to, but you're still too young. Get stronger, have patience, and one day I will help you get your revenge. Scruff sighed and walked over to him, licking his chin. Thanks, Jagger. Jagger looked at Scruff with a long, calculating look. You're flying. Remember, I'm here to help. You know, it's interesting. These kind of stories are always difficult to ascertain what's actually going to happen. It seems like Scruff's family has been killed by this other pack, and yet we don't know that for sure. It's possible that these kind of things don't turn out the way we expect, and that's why life is often, as we talked about, perhaps in peak, things are always coming out unexpected, and it's important not to jump to too many conclusions. I think that's especially important in our particular time right now. You know, there's a lot of speculation going on the internet and on TV, on news of all kinds of what's going to happen, how long it's going to take, and I have learned over my years that things never or rarely turn out exactly as you think they are, especially early in a situation. So I would just say, like I would tell Scruff here, don't jump to conclusions. Let the story fill its way out. This is Mr. Bob, and I hope you enjoyed the story. We'll talk next time.